All right, he's back with us a second time. He's a fantastic foreign policy correspondent over at Reuters, and that is our buddy Idrees Ali. Idrees, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping back on the podcast with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Idrees, I wanted to ask you because we follow each other on social media. We're going to get into some of your trip and following Secretary Austin all over the globe. You were in Singapore, you were in Brussels, so we want to hear more about that. But first, you had a huge run-in with DOD on a recent flight where they confiscated your phone. And I saw this, I reached out to you. I was like, this must have been crazy. Can you tell us a little bit more, our audience who maybe didn't follow it? There was a political subsequent article about it. There was a retraction of their policy. Tell our audience a little bit about what happened to you on this recent flight.
Yeah, so this was a trip with the Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Higgs, and we were heading to Norway. This is now earlier this month. Feels like a lot longer. But basically, I mean, just some background. I am not an American citizen. I'm a Canadian and Pakistani, so not an American citizen. But I've done about 50 trips with DoD officials, which is basically you travel in the plane of whoever the principal is, right? In this case, it was the Deputy Defense Secretary. And what basically happened was the Air Force had instituted a new policy just a couple of days before our trip that no non-US citizen would be allowed to use any electronic device on board an Air Force plane. That, it's usually not a problem because there are not many foreigners traveling on US military planes anyway. But there is this, frankly, very rare instance where there is a non-US person who happens to be a reporter traveling on a US Air Force plane because he is covering the Defense Department. So we get on the plane. I had been sort of told before by the Pentagon, like, hey, there's this new policy. It seems to be new, but we're working to get you an exemption. We're pretty optimistic that we'll get it. So, it was sort of like, okay, that they're working it out. So we get on the plane. We got on from Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. It's about an 8-hour flight. We take off. I'm using my phone, no issues. About 10 minutes into the flight, one of the crew members comes and talks to one of the press officers and sort of lets them know, like, hey, this is the policy. He can't use his phone. I wasn't particularly thrilled, but I had been sort of told, like, hey, there's this new policy. So I was like, okay, clearly there's been some miscommunication. I'll deal with it when the trip is over. So I turned my phone off and put it in the front pocket, seat back pocket. Another 10 minutes pass, and then the another flight crew member comes and lets them know again, like, hey, not only can he not have his cell phone, can he not use his cell phone, he can't have it, and we physically have to take it away. So they brought a Faraday bag, which essentially is a bag which blocks electronic signals coming in and coming out. And they asked me to, like, physically give my phone over, which I was not aware would be happening. And for a journalist, that's like the one thing you really don't do. Don't touch their notebook, don't touch their phone. I was sort of telling them, it's like, if you're like a soldier and your gun is taken away, it's not the same, but it's what it is for a reporter, right? A reporting device. So anyway, so I'm pretty unhappy at the time. We land. I shoot off a couple of emails to the Pentagon, and we're now in Norway, right? So we're 7 hours ahead, and I go to bed because it's like 11 p.m. To their credit, when I wake up, the Pentagon has sort of messaged me saying, look, we're really sorry about this. It's totally unacceptable. You won't have any problems going forward, but left the question, like, what is this policy? So a couple more hours pass by, and I'm very lucky to have very good colleagues in the Pentagon press corps who very quickly sort of took up the issue. We have a Pentagon Press Association, which sort of started reaching out to DoD officials first thing in the morning. And within a few hours, the Air Force firstly published what their policy actually was, and then said, we were wrong, we messed this one up, and we're just going to rescind the whole thing. And this was our bad. So, it was one of those things where, like, probably could have let it go after the first instance where they apologized. But I also realized, I work for Reuters as a non-American, so I feel like I'm in a position of privilege. Whereas if I was a reporter with an outlet that didn't have the same reach, would it have gotten so much attention? Would it have been rescinded? So it's one of those interesting scenarios with, again, I've been on like 50 trips now with DoD officials. It was the first instance, and it was A, very surprising, and B, I was like, okay, we need to, like, not just me, many of my great colleagues were like, this is unacceptable. And it's one of those things that, frankly, like, the Trump era administration was terrible for press freedom in many ways, but even during their tenure, nothing like this happened. So yeah.
Idrees, on that flight, are you the only person who is would be non-U.S. citizen?
Yeah. And in our press corps, in the Pentagon press corps, there's obviously a very large press corps, but if you talk about the core, sort of the outlets you would think of, it's just me and another a French journalist who would be considered non-American. So yeah, but on that flight, I was the only one.
Yeah. So when you were looking through, or when it was released, the actual details of that policy, did that gel with what you were experiencing with the different levels of confiscation?
Ask them the way you want to ask the question. Come on, you want to say.
Go ahead. Clear the lane.
Go ahead.
So I just think it's interesting that two people who were involved in this, checking out your phone, neither of which I don't think are checking passports. I mean, am I wrong on this? Because, like, I think you're saying members of the flight, right? So I don't know if they're flying the plane or like what they're doing on the plane, but they roll up on you conspicuously. Mm-hmm. And say, hey, level 1, you gotta put your phone away, which is no different. We've all experienced this. But then level 2, we're gonna hit this guy like he's a Dave Chappelle concert, right? Like, you gotta put it in a little plastic bag. No, we're trying to provide, protect from an EMP. Like, this is insane. Yeah. I'm just saying, had this been someone, of British descent, perhaps this is looked at differently.
I mean, all I'll say is two things. This was the first time this was ever used, this policy. So I don't know if there were instances where I was in the reporter and it was not used. And the second thing is, I did read the policy, and folks on the plane did go further than the policy, because the policy said the reporter is allowed to keep his phone with him. At the time, I had not seen the policy because they wouldn't release it, right?
Nor is it your responsibility to know the policy.
Right.
Like,
a policy that
that's not for the reporter's job. Like, that's, if it's a security protocol, that's fine. But I'm not surprised they went one step further. I'm just curious why.
Yeah. Okay, we leave it there. Move on. Yeah, it is a great question.
I do not have an answer.
I defer back. I lend back my time.
Thank you, sir. We take back that time. Idrees, I'm glad that all got resolved. I was messaging you after that all happened. I can't imagine how I would have, acted in that. We've all been journalists at one point. So I totally agree with you about the notepads and the phone. That's sacred ground there. I did want to ask you, though, because now you've been traveling post that. You went and followed Secretary Austin on his trip out in Asia to Singapore to meet with his Chinese counterpart. You went to Brussels as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that trip and what came out of there with some of Secretary Austin meeting with some of these leaders?
Yeah, so it was basically 2 trips rolled into one. Usually the trips we do are like 5 days. This was like 12 days. So the first half of that trip was to Singapore, where the annual Shangri-La dialogue happens. It's basically defense ministers from across Asia come, and historically it's been the venue where the US defense secretary and the Chinese defense minister meet, which hadn't happened in about 3 years because of COVID. So it was this extra significance for this dialogue. And so, Secretary Austin gave his speech, which was sort of the main event on one of the days, where, he reiterated that what China is doing in the region is unacceptable, it's coercive, it's, just against the foundations of democracy. And then, the next day, the Chinese defense minister gave his rebuttal, basically saying, the US is inflaming tensions, et cetera. But frankly, one of the main things that happened was the meeting between the two. It was the first in-person meeting between a US defense secretary and a Chinese defense minister under President Biden, partially because of COVID, partially because tensions just seem to be a bit more heightened than normal. So that meeting happened, and it was one of those meetings that, like, no one expected some miracle to come from. But as you guys know, the military is an interesting situation where even when things get really bad, you want some level of communication, even with an adversary or a competitor. And that was really the aim, which is like, hey, let's set up a channel with the Chinese where if, hypothetically speaking, there's a Chinese plane that crashes into a US plane or vice versa, I can call you up and say, look, this was unintentional. This is not an act of war. Let's not let this escalate, because many wars happen because some accident is misinterpreted. So the main aim was to sort of set this, hey, let's get to know each other, and I think they were pretty successful in that. So that was Singapore and Shangri-La, where the real focus was China, US. And then we hopped over to Thailand, which was sort of, we were there for 2 days. It was a couple of meetings. But then the other main event and the second part of the trip was the NATO Defense Ministerial in Brussels. And, as you guys have been talking about, the main event in terms of foreign policy has been Ukraine. And that didn't change. And, during the defense ministers meeting, the United States announced $1 billion more in weapons assistance to Ukraine. And really the reason for the meeting and for Secretary Austin to be there was to set up and tee up a bunch of decisions President Biden and the other NATO leaders essentially are going to take in the coming weeks during the NATO summit in Madrid, where they'll be talking about what the future of US troops in Europe looks like, what Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO might look like, how is NATO as a bloc going to counter China. So it's basically teeing up stuff that we're going to hopefully see come to fruition in the coming weeks and days.
Idrees, obviously you're closer to what's going on internationally than obviously the two of us. To the American citizen, our experience recently with news from Ukraine seems to have been taking a back burner between the January 6th hearings and honestly what's top of mind. That seems to be sort of our U.S. news cycle for the most part. For the viewer or listener who has not been paying as much attention to what's been going on in Ukraine, what would you identify as some of the key developments, just partly based on your experience with, seeing what was going on with NATO, but what should we be paying attention to? What's potentially getting downplayed right now, at least in terms of coverage?
Sure. I will say, just sort of tangent to that, I'm actually pleasantly surprised how long attention has stayed on Ukraine. I mean, we're nearly 4 months into this. I honestly thought maybe a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month at most. And you're right, it has diminished now, but for 3 months, I mean, it was like the main story. So anyway, I was very surprised, pleasantly surprised how much attention there was. And, we can get into a debate with this was a war in the Middle East. It probably wouldn't have been as focused, but it was a war in Europe. So, anyway, that's a side note. The main things that have really happened is there was a lot of attention in Ukraine when Kyiv, the capital, was still in play. And over the past couple of months, the Russians very quickly realized that they were not going to be able to take any major city in the west of Ukraine, whether that's Kyiv or Lviv, close to the border with Poland. And so they basically said this publicly, they sort of took a step back, regrouped in Belarus, regrouped back in Russia, and refocused their attention towards the east. And so now we're in this stage of the war in the Donbass, which is eastern Ukraine, where the Russians are actually making slow but incremental progress in some of their gains. We're seeing them not suffer the same sort of mind-boggling decisions that they had, which was trying to make crossings over rivers, even though they knew they were going to get struck. So they seem to have fixed some of the issues. There's still some major issues like logistics and all. But if I was sort of a listener and I hadn't paid attention for the past couple of weeks, I would say the big thing is the Russians are making progress in the east. They are consolidating their positions. We're also seeing sort of, so that's the tactical battlefield situation, the east, and the Russians not doing as badly as everyone thought. Their air defenses seem to be stronger now. So that's one thing. The second thing is, much like you said, we're also seeing a situation now where Ukrainian politicians, government officials, including Zelensky, are making exactly the same point you are, which is don't forget about the war in Ukraine. We're 4 months into this, there's fatigue, but don't forget about us because the war is going to continue for a long time. So we're probably in this phase where the Ukrainians are trying to convince the world, don't forget about us. The Russians are making some progress. It's interesting because the global effects of the war are sort of more and more domestic, even though I think we're forgetting the reason for some of them. Obviously inflation is not just because of Ukraine, but that's part of it. Gas prices, we're seeing stuff like Ukraine potentially joining the EU. So there are a couple of different moving parts, but, it'll be interesting, if we were to talk in another month, I don't know how much more would have changed, because we might be in this very sort of grinding situation where there's not much progress on the battlefield.
Idrees, I wanted to get to something you just mentioned a while back about Secretary Austin meeting with his Chinese counterpart there, Defense Minister General Wei Fenghe. I think I'm saying his name properly. For our listener out there, Nick loves saying the phrase "a moment of literacy." Taiwan, because there was some talks about what's happening with Taiwan, and recently there was an article about Taiwan scrambling jets to warn away Chinese planes. Can you take our audience, similar to that, you did a great job back in the Afghanistan episode, kind of explaining the different groups in the territory. Can you explain why Taiwan is such a hot button issue for the Chinese and what the U.S. does in helping Taiwan as well?
Sure. So, I mean, at its most basic level, Beijing sees Taiwan as a breakaway province and as a part of China, right? So their ultimate goal has been reunification. So that's the Chinese side of it. From the US side of it, they have the one China policy, which is the status quo should remain, which is Taiwan, we're not going to sort of recognize Taiwan as independent of China, or we're not going to necessarily recognize it as part of it. It's sort of a status quo agreement, which is like, hey, let's just keep things as they are. So you have one force, which is the US, saying, don't change anything. And China, which is saying our ultimate goal is to change things, which is reunification, right? So that's the broader context we're working in. And obviously, Xi Jinping has been in power for a long time. And, as many leaders get, deeper into their tenure and regime, they start looking at historical precedent. And one of the things that he is believed to want is sort of reunification of Taiwan, and maybe sooner rather than later. So for the past few years, we've seen US officials sort of steadily increase the drumbeat of what they see as preparation by China for potentially overtaking Taiwan one day. And, a couple of years ago, the estimate that was given by one US admiral who headed Indo-Pacific Command was 2027. So that was sort of the marker when the US military believes the Chinese will be militarily ready to take over. And then Ukraine happened, right? And it sort of brought up this question of, well, if Xi sees Russia invading Ukraine, and he sees the US response, how will that change his calculus on Ukraine? Or on Taiwan? Will he see the US response as not being very forceful, and that means he'll be more emboldened? Or will he see the US response as pretty severe and make him take a step back? From our understanding and everything we've talked to with sources, it's that so far there is no evidence that he has changed his mind on Taiwan in one way or another because of Ukraine. And he hasn't changed the planning or sort of the dynamics of how he's thinking about Ukraine or Taiwan because of the Ukraine situation. And part of the reason is, I think he has seen, look, the US is not messing around when it comes to helping allies, which is something you could have debated maybe after Afghanistan. And the US, to its credit, has given about $6 billion in aid to Ukraine, which is not a part of NATO. The US has already committed to helping Taiwan defend itself in the case of an invasion. And so that, I think, it's not a treaty, but it's sort of this agreement, understanding is something the Chinese realize that the US will actually come to their defense. The only thing I will add is Taiwan is very different from Ukraine in that an invasion of Ukraine is in some ways actually easier because it's a landlocked country. Well, it's not landlocked, but it's basically surrounded by land on three sides. The Russians can invade over ground. If you're the Chinese and you're looking to invade Taiwan, Taiwan's an island. So you have to land, craft and bring troops off. That means you can just mine all of Taiwan and make it so much tougher. So it's an interesting question because there are similarities in the global context, but when you look at the military tactics, They're very, very different. And so the sense that I got after this trip is, obviously the US is very concerned about China and Taiwan, but they don't have any evidence to suggest that China is ramping up or speeding up their reunification plans because of Ukraine.